Okay. Super. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. It's a great delight to be here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, including the eminent abbot, the wonderful organizers, Dr. Bata, Tuya. Thank you also to my wonderful congenial colleagues from overseas, from India, the US, Italy, and the UK. I am a psychologist, and for the last 15 years I have been working on meditation, both experimentally but also working with colleagues who are historians of meditation, like quite a lot of you who are experts on the practical and historical side of meditation. And with them, I have learned a lot. So what I'm going to talk about today is somewhat different from what my colleagues who study meditation usually do. My main point is that we have to move from a model of meditation studies that is only looking at the psychological, physiological effects focused on well-being towards a more multidimensional model which looks at the reasons why people meditate, the traditional motivations to meditate within these traditions, which is to move beyond oneself. And I will start with a brief framework of what has happened in the West. So until the 1960s, meditation was something of a niche counterculture. So here we have the 1960s hippie family meditating together. We have the angst teenager asking, are we there yet? Have you arrived at nirvana? So it's still very much something on the fringe of Western culture. But very quickly, things have changed. So these are nationally representative samples which show that, now we have about 15% of the US population interested in practices like yoga and meditation. I should say that most of the people starting meditation today in the West, they're doing it via a phone app, not through a teacher, but using a phone app. Still, it's a very significant number of people that are interested in meditation. How did this happen? This happened because of science. There have been what I call two waves of science of meditation. The first one started in 1970 with transcendental meditation. And what transcendental meditation and then mindfulness tried to do was to convert a religious language coming from Hinduism and Buddhism into a secularized, psychologized language. And they did this very, very well, starting in 1970 with transcendental meditation. So when Maharishi, who was the founding figure of transcendental meditation, came to the UK and then the US, he realized very quickly that the king and the queen of civilization in the West was not religion, but science. Therefore, he recruited scientists from the major universities to conduct studies. And this was a major break from what happened before. Before 1970, we mostly had scientific studies with experts. So we had monks being studied. But in 1970, we started having normal people that would learn meditation for 6 months, 1 year, and then we would test them. So this has radically changed the science of meditation. Now, what mindfulness has done 30 years onwards is exactly the same that they were doing before. Exactly the same kind of interests. How does meditation change our health, our body, our psychology? How does it change even intelligence or personality? And how does it also change other people? How do we affect not just ourselves, but the collective around us? These have been the major concerns of the science of meditation. And here again, just to give a very graphic idea of the extraordinary growth, both the media and the scientific literature on meditation for the past 50 years, but particularly in the last 30 years. So very briefly, to give you an idea of why I am talking to you here today. Most of my work is on psychology and religion. But 15 years ago, I was approached by an NGO, an organization that organizes meditation and yoga classes across prisons in the United Kingdom. So they have teachers that go every day to prisons across the UK. And their idea is that by getting prisoners, so people who have done something very wrong in a society, to meditate and do yoga, this will allow them to experience something different, which will get them back into society and be functional members. So we ran a study with them, showing the usual things psychologists are interested. Does this allow them to have less stress? Does this allow them to have higher focus? And the results were generally interesting, and this was replicated some years later in another European country, and they had very similar results. So showing that these techniques are beneficial for a vulnerable population that is in prison. And a couple of years after that, I thought, let me write a book about this. Not an academic book, but what we call a popular science book for normal people, not just academics, to read it. So I wrote this book with a clinical psychologist. And while doing research for this book, and that's really the benefit of writing a non-academic book, it allows you to read a lot. So I was reading on 50 years of the science of meditation, and I stumbled upon something which most of my colleagues were completely ignorant of, which are the potential adverse effects of meditation practices. So we ran a study looking at the literature starting back in the 1970s was telling us about how meditation might produce something which is not just pleasant and positive. And of course, all of you here who have been brought up in a Buddhist tradition know about this, because this is part of the tradition. And something which I learned from historians of meditation is that the early accounts of meditation sickness are actually coming from the Buddhist tradition and go back to the 5th century. And within all religious traditions, there is an understanding that certain practices should be done only by certain people, and that one practice of meditation is not universal, should not be done by everyone. There is a subtlety and complexity about this which most psychologists are ignorant of. And the follow-up work I did on this is this Oxford Handbook of Meditation, and in which I learned a lot. And this is just to give you really a glimpse of the extraordinary variety of meditation practices. So these are just some examples from the various traditions. And at the top, purposefully, we call these therapeutic techniques. So all of these techniques, like the mindfulness-based stress reduction or transcendental meditation, they have really been adapted to be therapeutic techniques. While what the other techniques are trying to do is something very different. So for example, I give a course at Oxford University mostly to Western students on meditation, and they are very shocked when I tell them that a very common Buddhist practice is to meditate on a decomposing corpse. The practice of meditating on death is not exclusive to the Buddhist tradition. It happens in the Hindu tradition, but it also happens in the Christian tradition, where there are even chapels made of skeletons and bones. The reflection upon death is an important part of all these traditions, because it is what is going to happen to us. Therefore, rethinking, contemplating, meditating upon our deaths is a way to transcend our worldly concerns. And of course, you would all be familiar with the way of the Bodhisattva, where there are these wonderful, very ironic passages about how the body of your former lover, now you don't feel attracted to it like you used to when this person was living. Now, as I was saying, there is this extraordinary variety, and there is multiple ways of classifying these varieties. So when you look at techniques like the mindfulness-based stress reduction or the muscular relaxation or TM, what these techniques have in common is that they are trying to quiet the mind. But very many of traditional techniques are doing something different. So if you think of Patanjali's sutras, Ekagrata, this very focused, this sense of deep absorption which leads you into an ecstatic state, is very different. Or if you think of the Muslim dhikr, where you're chanting the names of God in a rhythmic and progressively faster way, it again leads into a very ecstatic, altered state of consciousness. And of course, you have also more analytical, intellectual techniques. So Tuya was telling me that part of her practice is to start with the study of scriptures and move into that. And there's things like Lectio Divina in the Christian tradition, which are very similar. Now, someone mentioned this study, which is a meta-analysis of fMRI studies. And here again, what this meta-analysis is clearly showing is that meditation techniques are different, and they even recruit different areas of the brain. So overall, different modalities of meditation are doing something to your body and to your mind. They're not the same. And when it comes to the goals of meditation, these also are different. So if within a Buddhist or Hindu tradition, you're seeking the liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth, within a Taoist tradition, you're seeking kind of harmony or balance, or even an achievement of physical immortality. So there are also different practices which are associated with different goals. Now, this is really the crux of the key point which I'd like to share with you. There is a tension between the goals of meditation practices as they are practiced in the religious traditions and the way psychologists have adapted them. So we have this tension between self-transcendent goals. I am doing meditation today because I'm trying to move beyond my own self-concerns and to move beyond this physical world, while on the other hand, mindfulness-based stress reduction and transcendental meditation is mostly focused on self-enhancement, and in particularly in what we might call stress release. And I'll tell you something about that later. So we have, on the one hand, this anti-stress relaxation model and what we might call this anti-gravitational self-transcendence, where you're really putting all of your energy in moving beyond the world. What classical sociologists like Max Weber have talked about in terms of world transcending aims. Now, this did not happen just overnight. It has been happening for over 100 years. So I have mentioned the example of relaxation. Progressive muscular relaxation was in itself already a first attempt to get hold of religious techniques and to make them purely secularized. So Jacobson was the first person to do this. And look at the subtitle of his book, Practical Methods for Reducing the Tensions of Modern Living. So this is what we call today stress, and this is what gave origin to the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. So Jacobson also called these tensions Americanitis. Americanitis being the neurosis, the stress of the modern world that came about because of industrialization. And I suppose this is very important today for Mongolia because it has a very quick-paced industrialization. So this has been happening for a while. These techniques have been developed in the Western world and adapted to deal with stress. And here we have the kind of anti-stress model. Quite a lot of my colleagues are using this mindfulness gym metaphor, that doing mindfulness is good for the mind, like going to the gym is good. Although, as psychologists, we all know that the mind does not work like a muscle, or only in very small ways. And here we have, from the Mongolian tradition, this mandala. And this is a common practice, I mean, from Tantra Buddhism, but also from Hindu Tantra, where the person who is meditating is focusing oneself on the image of a deity. And this is not a simple focus just because it is a beautiful image. The aim is to become entirely absorbed by the image so that you become the deity. You become the image. And in some ways this is similar to the practice of the heart prayer in the early Christianity, where you repeat this simple prayer, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. And you're supposed to repeat this until it takes over your life and your breath, and you even say it in your sleep, so that you become like Christ. So the idea is very similar to this. By focusing on what you want to become like, you are so absorbed that you are deeply transformed. So here we have a clearly self-transcendent model. Now, religious traditions, of course, have been aware of the power, the extraordinary power of meditation practices for a long time. And they know that people can use them for their own self-interest. So there are very early, and there's a long tradition of criticisms of using these techniques for self-enhancement. So this is one from a very early text from Taoism, in which they are criticizing the people who are using these Taoist practices only to attain long life. The meaning here is that you shouldn't just use this for your own self-interest, but to move beyond that. So, I am going to suggest that the science, the current science of meditation, has to move to a different level, has to incorporate so these are the three different reasons why we should move into creating a different science of meditation. So my first reason is that monocultures destroy ecological biodiversity. And this is a very graphic depiction. So this is in Brazil, the Amazon forest on the right hand, and this is the Amazon forest after you have taken it away to build a soy plantation. If you have ever been in a thick forest, like the Black Forest in Germany, there's very little light coming in. So the Amazon forest is like that. It is so full of vegetation and of tall trees that it's very dark there. There is this astonishing biodiversity. And meditation practices are like the Amazon forest. There is this extraordinary variety which engages our body and our minds in very different ways. By reducing this to only mindfulness or transcendental meditation, we are destroying this biodiversity. We are not respecting or acknowledging that meditation is like that and not like that. So this is one reason to move away from this monoculture of the science of only studying one technique. The other reason is that meditation practices give us a glimpse of consciousness in a very, what we might call unaltered, but they give us maps of thinking of ourselves in a very different way. So this is something from the 1970s which we don't use today. Psychologists notoriously have shied away from thinking about wide models of the mind. However, within meditation traditions, there is a very clear sense that there is a progression, there is a hierarchy of states of consciousness, often associated with different practices. I mean, here, because you're coming from a Buddhist tradition, I'm giving examples of the Hindu and the Christian tradition. And they have particularities. I'm not saying that one hierarchy is identical or similar, quite the opposite. They are different. They have different particularities, and we should acknowledge and honor those particularities. Finally, the third reason why we should explore these other meditation practices is because they allow us to tap and explore the deep interpersonal and social effects of this. So there is now an interest in compassion-based meditation in West, and psychologists are studying it. However, what psychology says about the possibilities of compassion and what Mahayana Buddhism, for example, say about this are very, very different things. From a psychological perspective, if you're dedicating, if you're putting effort into loving other people, this is taking away from your own resources, and there is a limit to this. What Mahayana Buddhists and the other religious traditions are saying is the opposite. There are possibilities of being infinitely loving. And this happens also, of course, in the Christian tradition. I mentioned here the medieval gift of tears, in which your own body is transformed. So the last stage of this, your body becomes so transformed that it exudes this perfume, this wonderful perfume, and other people will come towards you because they want to be transformed in the same way that you have been. Okay. So I'll just give a very brief example to finish, how we're trying to bring this into psychological science. We are now running a study on heart-centered meditation. And why heart-centered meditation? So, like compassion-based meditation, within the Christian and Islamic traditions, there is a long history of heart-centered practices in which you engaged both your breathing and visualization. There's very complex visualization techniques that go back centuries. But the aim is to transform yourself by purifying your heart. And the idea being that the heart becomes a source of special spiritual knowledge. So we have been doing this, it's still ongoing. But here, and we are contrasting this with people who are just doing the mindfulness-based stress reduction. And while people who are doing the mindfulness-based stress reduction talk about how their body feels more relaxed, the people doing the religious meditation are engaged in a much wider array of emotions and cognition. So here, for example, we're showing someone who is saying she's feeling the mercy of God towards her, going into her heart. Now, what is important about moving into this multimodal of meditation is that it also breaks some of the ideas we get from psychology. So psychologists like to quote Pascal, saying that this quote, the heart has reasons which reason knows nothing about. This is actually talking about dual mode processing. There's a way which is rational, there is a mode which is emotional. However, if you read Pascal, what he's talking about is completely different. He's talking about a third mode of cognition, which is a heart-centered mode of cognition. So by looking at these other meditation practices, we're actually bringing something into psychology which breaks common accepted knowledge. And here I'd like to finish by suggesting that within your own Mahayana tradition, but also the cultural Mongolian tradition, we have the possibility of doing something which anthropologists are calling a reverse anthropology. And this is a wonderful example. So Kopenawa, he's a shaman from the Yanomami tribe in the Amazon. He was 15 years old when he met the first white person. So his culture was entirely, indigenous before he met. And he comes to the West and he goes back and writes about us, white people, from his perspective. That's why he's doing a reverse anthropology. Now, and he's saying things like this: the white people, they do not dream as far as we do. They sleep a lot, but only dream of themselves. And here, there is a glimpse. So their dream life is very different from the Western dream life. They engage with it. They believe that your soul goes out of your body and you go and meet people from your family and from your culture. And then he says, white people only dream about themselves and what they want to possess. They want a new car, they want a new home, they want a new girlfriend. They're so obsessed by what they want to get that they only dream about that. So there are models within these religious traditions about how our psychologies are. And for example, you have your own Mongolian system of traditional medicine, which includes some of those ideas about how we function psychologically. So I was, for example, reading the booklet of this conference, and there is a question and answer section in which they ask, so according to Mongolian traditional medicine, how do you think about stress? And the answer is, stress is a spiritual illness, often associated with particular spirits. And this is very much what this indigenous person from the Amazon is saying, that stress is coming about because of our obsession, spiritual obsession with wanting more and more. Right. So these are some of my collaborators on this study. Thank you very much for your attention.
Хэлтгэгч Мигэль Фариас-Доктор баярлалаа. Thank you for your interesting presentation. За энэ завсар хэлэхэд саяны хэлтгэл тавьсан Мигэль Фариас эрдэм профессор маань за Будда пил буюу Бурхны үрэлгээд тэгээд бясалгал таныг өөрчилж чадах уу гэдэг номыг мөн зохиогч нь гэж байгаамаа. За танд баярлалаа. За дараагийн